I love you more than words could ever say. I promise I will always be by your side.
The entire ballroom fell silent. Korea's most feared mafia boss had faced assassins, billion-dollar betrayals, and enemies who wanted him dead. But nothing prepared him for the words his wife spoke into that microphone. For 7 years, he believed she never loved him. In less than 3 minutes, she proved he had been wrong about everything. By the end of her speech, even the people who feared him watched as tears rolled down his face. Before this story breaks you wide open, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Because the man who survived 17 assassination attempts couldn't survive one woman's truth. Only cold-hearted people and emotional cowards skip this one. Stay with us. This story will absolutely wreck you in the best way possible. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a marriage where two people have stopped asking each other the important questions. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply settles into the walls of a house like cold air through old windows, gradual, invisible, and completely devastating by the time anyone thinks to check. Kang Min-jae had lived inside that silence for so long he had started to mistake it for peace. He sat at the head of his study that Tuesday morning, a room that cost more to furnish than most people's entire apartments, surrounded by reports from 4 different countries, 2 encrypted phones, and a security detail of 9 men stationed across the grounds of their sole estate. His suit was pressed. His expression was unreadable. His coffee was exactly the temperature he preferred, prepared by someone who was not his wife, because his wife had learned 3 years into their marriage that he preferred to handle his own coffee, and she had simply never brought it up again. This, Min-jae had decided, was proof she didn't care. He was spectacularly wrong. He was also, in the tradition of brilliant men who build elaborate mental architectures to avoid admitting vulnerability, completely committed to being wrong. The door to his study opened at 8:47. No knock, which meant it was either an emergency or Amma. Min-jae had long understood that his wife operated under the working theory that the rules of a house applied to everyone except the person who quietly kept the house from falling apart. She entered wearing a simple gold kaftan, her natural hair pinned back with the kind of effortless elegance that made every stylist she'd ever met quietly furious. She carried a clay bowl with both hands. The smell reached him before she did. Palm nut, smoked fish, the specific warmth of a recipe that had traveled all the way from her mother's kitchen in Accra to land, without ceremony or explanation, on the desk of one of Seoul's most feared criminal minds. She set it down in front of him. She smiled. That quiet, unreadable smile that had been dismantling him for 7 years without his permission. Then she left. No explanation. No, I thought you'd like something warm. No performance of affection, no waiting for gratitude, no lingering in the doorway to see if he would look up. She simply placed a bowl of her mother's soup on his desk and walked back down the hallway as though she had done nothing more significant than return a borrowed pen. Min-jae stared at the bowl for a full 90 seconds. His lead intelligence officer, Baek Sung-hyun, a man who had once tracked a weapons dealer across 6 countries using only a blurry photograph and a receipt from a noodle shop, was seated across the desk, mid-sentence about a developing situation in Busan. He stopped talking. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Min-jae's face. He made the intelligent professional decision to suddenly find his own folder of documents extremely interesting. She does that, Min-jae said finally. Yes, sir, Sung-hyun said carefully, in the tone of a man who understood that the correct response to anything his employer said about his wife was quiet agreement followed by immediate subject change. She never explains it. No, sir. She just does things and says nothing. I've noticed, sir. Min-jae picked up his chopsticks, set them down, picked them up again. The soup smelled extraordinary. It smelled, if he was being precise, like someone had put considerable thought and care into making something for a specific person, which was exactly the kind of observation he refused to sit with for longer than 3 seconds. Pull up the Busan report, he said. 7 years. That was how long Kang Min-jae and Ama Serwa Mensa had been married. Long enough for the world to have accepted their union as one of those unusual, quietly functional arrangements between 2 powerful families. Ghanaian old money meeting Korean organized crime with all the romantic energy of a bilateral trade agreement. Long enough for the gossip columns to have moved on. long enough for Min Jae to have thoroughly convinced himself that his wife's composure was simply the polished surface of a woman fulfilling an obligation. He had been hurt before. Once. Deeply, and in the specific way that only happens when you make the catastrophic mistake of letting someone see the soft parts of you. He had been 24, not yet fully in control of the empire, and the woman he had trusted had made her calculations and chosen differently. He had not cried. He had simply gone very quiet, built several more walls, bought 3 additional companies, and decided that being loved was a liability he could no longer afford. He had walked into his marriage with Amma the way a man walks into a negotiation he doesn't plan to lose, composed, guarded, and preemptively unaffected. It was a masterpiece of self-protection. It was also, as it turned out, completely unnecessary because the woman he had prepared to feel nothing for had already quietly decided that she was going to love him whether he made it convenient or not. He just didn't know that yet. He ate the soup at his desk, alone, while Sung-hyun updated him on Busan. It was the best thing he had tasted in 3 months. He didn't tell anyone. That night, he passed Amma in the hallway outside the library. She was carrying a book and wearing reading glasses she claimed she didn't need. She looked up when she heard him, and that smile appeared again, warm, self-contained, entirely her own. "Good evening," she said. "Good evening," he said. She continued down the hallway. He continued in the opposite direction. 2 people who had shared a home for 7 years, moving through it like polite strangers in a well-managed hotel. Min Jae reached his bedroom, closed the door, and stood in the dark for a moment longer than a man of his particular reputation probably should have. The soup had been perfect. It was the kind of perfect that required knowing someone, the kind of perfect that didn't happen by accident. He pushed the thought aside, the way he pushed aside every thought that threatened the architecture of certainty he had spent 7 years constructing. He was very good at it. He was, as he would discover too late, building walls inside a house that was already, quietly, magnificently full of love. He just hadn't looked up long enough to see it. If there was one thing Kang Min-jae understood better than anyone in Seoul's criminal underworld, it was the architecture of power. He knew how it moved, how it shifted, how it disguised itself as something harmless right before it destroyed you. He had studied it the way other men studied scripture, with devotion, with discipline, and with the healthy paranoia of someone who understood that the moment you stopped paying attention was the moment everything collapsed. What he had never studied, not once in 38 years of living, was the architecture of a woman who loved quietly. He didn't even know that was a category. Year 3 of their marriage arrived the way trouble always did in Min Jae's world, dressed in something respectable. On the surface, everything was stable. The empire was expanding. 3 new legitimate businesses had been added to the portfolio as cover, the kind that generated enough paperwork to make even the most determined government investigator lose the will to live. His rivals were, for the most part, behaving themselves. His PR team had recently managed to place a flattering profile of him in a financial magazine, which described him as a visionary entrepreneur with an eye for undervalued markets. Min Jae had read it twice and found it both accurate and deeply amusing. Then the whispers started. It began the way all dangerous things began in his world, as a rumor too small to take seriously passed between the wrong people in the right rooms. The Choi Syndicate, a rival organization with the moral compass of a broken GPS and the subtlety of a grenade, had apparently decided that the most efficient way to destabilize Kang Min-jae's empire was not through direct confrontation. No, they had looked at everything he had built, everything he controlled, and they had identified what they believed was the single weakest point in his entire operation: his wife. Specifically, the story they intended to sell was this: that Amma Serwa Mensa was deeply unhappy, that the foreign bride trapped in a cold, arranged marriage was quietly planning an exit, that the empire was fracturing from within because the man at the center of it couldn't even keep his own household together. It was, Min Jae would later admit, a clever play. Embarrassingly clever. Because in their world, the perception of personal weakness traveled faster than any weapon, and a man whose wife didn't respect him was a man whose associates started quietly exploring other options. The journalist they had purchased was named Oh Tae-yang. He worked for a mid-tier publication that positioned itself as fearless investigative media, but functioned in practice as a carefully managed rumor delivery service for whoever paid the most. Oh Tae-yang had been given a folder, a deadline, and a number that had clearly made him very comfortable with abandoning whatever remained of his journalistic integrity. He had the story ready. He did not publish it. What happened instead was this. 4 days before Min Jae even learned the rumor existed, Ama Serwa Mensa walked into a quiet cafe in Mapogu, sat down across from Oh Tae-young, ordered herself a hibiscus tea, and placed a folder on the table between them. Oh Tae-young looked at the folder. He looked at the woman across from him, composed, unhurried, wearing the expression of someone who had already decided how this meeting was going to end before she arrived. He looked back at the folder. "Open it," Amma said pleasantly. He opened it. The color left his face slowly, the way water drains from a bathtub, gradual, then suddenly all at once. Inside was documented evidence, meticulously compiled, that the Choi Syndicate had been financing human trafficking operations across 4 countries in Southeast Asia. Financial records, shipping manifests, names. The kind of evidence that didn't just end careers, it ended freedom. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. Amma wrapped both hands around her tea. "That's not the interesting question. Then what is? The interesting question," she said, "is what kind of journalist you actually want to be. Because right now you're holding a story that will define your entire career. The only remaining decision is which story that will be." She tilted her head slightly. "The fabricated one about an unhappy wife, or the true one about an organization trafficking human beings across international borders?" Oh, Tae-yang stared at her for a long time. "Why are you giving this to me?" Amma smiled. It was the same quiet smile she gave her husband when he was working too hard and pretending he wasn't tired. The same smile that drove Min Jae quietly to distraction because he could never fully read it. "Because the truth," she said simply, "is always a better story." She finished her tea. She left. 3 weeks later, the Choi Syndicate collapsed under a scandal so catastrophic and so thoroughly documented that their legal team needed 2 full years and 4 different law firms to even begin containing the damage. Arrests followed. Extraditions followed those. The whisper campaign about Min Jae's allegedly crumbling marriage dissolved so completely, it was as though it had never existed. Min Jae spent 6 weeks trying to trace who had delivered the intelligence that destroyed his most irritating rival. He assigned Sung-hyun to it personally. Sung-hyun, the man who had tracked an arms dealer using a blurry photograph and a noodle shop receipt, came back with nothing. "Whoever did this," Sung-hyun said carefully, placing his empty folder on the desk, "covered every trace with a level of precision I have not seen since." He paused. "Since you, sir, in 2019. Min Jae was quiet for a moment. "Keep looking." Sung-hyun nodded, though his expression suggested he already understood that some puzzles were not meant to be solved. That same evening, Min Jae came home to find Amma in the sitting room with a book. She looked up when he entered. She asked him if he had eaten. He said yes. She nodded, returned to her book, and mentioned without looking up that there was jollof rice in the kitchen if he changed his mind. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. This brilliant, quiet, entirely self-possessed woman who had somehow become the most unreadable person in his entire world, and felt, for just a moment, that he was missing something important. He went to his office. He did not find the jollof rice until 11:30 that night. It was predictably magnificent. There is a specific type of loneliness that belongs exclusively to people who are surrounded by everything except the one thing they actually need. It isn't the loneliness of empty rooms or quiet evenings. It is the loneliness of sitting across a dinner table from someone and realizing you have absolutely no idea who they are. Not because they are hiding, but because you stopped looking somewhere along the way and convinced yourself the view hadn't changed. Min Jae was an expert at this particular loneliness. He had furnished it beautifully, the way wealthy people furnish all their emptiness, with activity, with purpose, with the relentless forward motion of a man who had decided that building things was a reasonable substitute for feeling them. By year 4 of their marriage, his empire had expanded into legitimate real estate across 3 continents, a private equity firm that made serious people in serious suits take him very seriously, and a security operation so sophisticated it had been quietly consulted by 2 separate governments who publicly pretended not to know he existed. He was, by every measurable standard, winning. He came home at midnight most nights, sometimes later. The estate was always impeccably maintained when he arrived. Lights adjusted, temperature perfect, the kind of order that didn't happen by accident but by someone paying close, consistent attention. He noticed the order. He did not think to ask who was maintaining it, the way a man might enjoy excellent weather without considering the meteorological systems responsible. Amma, meanwhile, was building an empire of her own. This was the part that would have genuinely floored him had he known. Not because he doubted her intelligence. He had never once made the mistake of doubting her intelligence, even in the early days when he was working very hard to feel nothing about her. But because the scale of what she had quietly assembled in the margins of their marriage was, frankly, extraordinary. It had started with one small investment in year one, a textile business in Accra run by three women who needed capital and had the kind of ferocious competence that only needed one opportunity to become something significant. Amma had provided the capital. She had asked for nothing in return except quarterly reports and the promise that they would hire locally. Within 18 months, the business had tripled. She reinvested. Then again. Then into a logistics company. Then a technology firm based in Nairobi that was doing things with agricultural data that made venture capitalists in California feel personally embarrassed for not discovering it first. By year 4, Amasarwa Mensah had quietly, without fanfare or announcement, built a portfolio that would have made the financial press extremely excited if she had any intention of letting them know it existed. She did not. She had structured everything carefully, layered through holding companies with the kind of architectural precision that suggested either extraordinary legal counsel or a naturally strategic mind. It was the latter. The money she directed toward Minjae's world was invisible by design, anonymous donations to foundations that cleaned up the edges of the empire's public reputation. Scholarships funded through untraceable channels that bore no connection to either of their names. 3 schools built across Ghana, Kenya, and the Philippines. Each one registered under a nonprofit with a board of directors that included nobody famous and everybody capable. She told the board the donations were anonymous. She told her mother she was simply staying occupied. She told herself, in the quiet hours before sleep, that this was enough. That loving someone through action rather than declaration was still love. That the schools would stand long after the silence between them had either broken or hardened permanently. And that if she could not say the words out loud, if saying them meant painting a target on the one person she couldn't afford to lose, then she would build something that said it for her. This is the part of the story where someone should have sat Amma down and gently explained that men, particularly men who have spent years perfecting emotional unavailability as a survival strategy, are extraordinarily poor at reading architectural love languages. No one did. Minjae, for his part, was watching her across rooms and dinners and occasional mornings in the kitchen, and cataloging every piece of evidence that confirmed what he had already decided to believe. She never reached for his hand. She never asked him to stay when he left. She never looked wounded when he canceled dinners, never looked relieved when he made them. She maintained the same steady warmth with everyone, the household staff, her friends who visited from Accra, the elderly neighbor 3 houses down who had once complimented her garden and received in return a full year of weekly flower arrangements delivered to his door. She treated Minjae, the feared head of Seoul's most powerful criminal organization, with precisely the same dignified warmth she gave everyone else. He found this unbearable. It should be noted here, with the gentle sarcasm the situation fully deserves, that what Minjae actually wanted was to be treated differently. Not better. Differently. To be the person she reached for instead of the person she simply, consistently, infuriatingly included. He wanted evidence of preference. He wanted to matter to her in a way that was visible, measurable, and preferably slightly desperate. Instead, she asked him, on a random Wednesday evening, whether he preferred the blue curtains or the gray ones for the east sitting room, and when he said he didn't mind, she chose the blue, and they were perfect. And he spent 3 days being quietly furious about curtains. He was, it must be said, not handling any of this particularly well. He said nothing. He worked more. He added another company to the portfolio. He had Sung Hun run a routine background check on a business associate, and then sat at his desk for 40 minutes staring at a financial report he had already read twice without absorbing a single number. Sung Hun, who had been with him long enough to recognize the specific quality of his employer's distraction, quietly placed a cup of coffee on the corner of the desk and left without being asked. Minjae picked up the coffee. Down the hallway, in the library, Amma was on a video call with the principal of the school she had just finished funding in Kumasi. The principal was describing the children, how they ran into the building on the first day, how one small girl had touched the chalkboard like it was something sacred, how the teachers had cried at the opening ceremony. Amma listened. Her eyes filled. She smiled the way she smiled when no one was watching, wide and unguarded and completely, devastatingly real. She thought of Min Jae. She thought of the way he had quietly funded an entire village's relocation 3 years ago and sworn everyone involved to silence. She thought about how she had found out not from him, but from one of the displaced families who hadn't known who to thank and had simply described a man in an expensive coat who had shown up, handled everything, and left without giving his name. She had built a school there. She had never told him. She finished the call. She closed her laptop. She sat in the quiet library for a long moment, in the house they shared without truly sharing, and she loved him with the particular ache of someone who has made peace with loving in silence. Then she went to check whether he had remembered to eat dinner. He hadn't. She wasn't surprised. The award ceremony invitation arrived on a Friday. It came addressed exclusively to Amma, not to Mr. and Mrs. Kang, not to the estate's general correspondence inbox that Sung-hyun monitored with the dedication of a man who took information security personally, but directly to Amma's private email address, which approximately 6 people in the world possessed. The subject line read, Global Humanitarian Recognition, Confidential Nomination Confirmation. The sender was the International Development and Philanthropy Council, a Geneva-based organization whose annual award ceremony was the kind of event that made presidents rearrange their calendars and billionaires practice looking humble. Amma read the email twice. Then she closed her laptop, went to the kitchen, made herself a cup of sabalo, the deep hibiscus drink her mother had taught her to brew on the specific occasions when life required something stronger than water, but more dignified than wine, and sat at the kitchen counter for a very long time. She had been nominated anonymously. Someone on the council had connected the threads of her philanthropy, the schools, the foundations, the quietly funded programs across 3 continents, and had decided that whoever was responsible deserved to be recognized publicly, whether they wanted to be or not. Amma respected the impulse. She found the timing catastrophically inconvenient. Public recognition meant exposure. Exposure meant people asking questions. Questions meant journalists. Journalists meant the specific category of determined, underpaid, deeply motivated individual who treated anonymous donor not as a boundary to respect, but as a puzzle to solve. And if someone solved that puzzle completely, if they traced the philanthropy back far enough and cross-referenced it with the right names and financial structures, the story they would find was not simply a generous woman doing good work quietly. The story they would find was a woman who had been systematically, strategically protecting her husband's empire and public image for 7 years, using her own money, her own intelligence, and her own carefully maintained invisibility. That story, in the wrong hands, became a weapon. She almost declined. She drafted the response 3 times. Each version was polite, gracious, and firmly final. Each time she reached the send button, she stopped. Because underneath the strategic calculation, underneath the careful risk assessment, underneath 7 years of disciplined self-erasure, there was a part of Amma Serwa Mensa that was profoundly tired. Not of the work. Never of the work. The schools, the children, the families lifted by the programs she funded. All of that filled something in her that nothing else reached. She was tired of the invisibility itself, tired of watching the results of her love exist in the world while the person she had built it all for remained entirely unaware that she was the architect. She was tired, if she was being completely precise, of a man who could detect a shift in geopolitical power from across a dinner table, but could not detect that his wife had been quietly, ferociously devoted to him for the entirety of their marriage. She accepted the invitation. She told no one. Across the estate, Min Jae was having what Sung-hyun would later diplomatically describe in his personal notes as a difficult quarter emotionally, expressed primarily through increased working hours and an unusual interest in restructuring organizations that did not require restructuring. The truth was simpler and considerably more embarrassing for a man of his reputation. He had started noticing things. Small things accumulating with the quiet persistence of water finding its way through stone. The blue curtains in the east sitting room that were objectively exactly right. The way the estate ran with a seamless precision that had nothing to do with the staff and everything to do with Amma's invisible management of approximately 40 moving parts she had never once asked to be credited for. The abenquan that had appeared on his desk that Tuesday morning, and which he had found himself thinking about at completely inappropriate moments, during security briefings, during contract negotiations, once, mortifyingly, during a tense phone call with a government official who was attempting to be intimidating. He had also started noticing her absence in rooms she hadn't yet left. This was the most inconvenient development of all. Min-jae would be sitting in the study, working, entirely focused, and would become aware, without any logical reason, that Amma was not in the house. Not because anything had changed, not because she had announced her departure, simply because the quality of the air in the estate shifted slightly when she was gone, the way a room changes when a window closes, and he had apparently become attuned to this without his own permission. He found this information about himself deeply annoying. He mentioned none of it to Sung-hun, who was perceptive enough to have noticed all of it anyway and wise enough to keep that observation entirely to himself. What Min-jae did instead, because he was fundamentally a man more comfortable with action than admission, was commission a quiet, thorough review of all anonymous philanthropic activity connected in any traceable way to their household. He told Sung-hun it was routine financial auditing. Sung-hun wrote routine financial auditing in his notes with the serene expression of a man who had learned that his employer's definitions of words were occasionally creative. The audit came back 3 weeks later. Sung-hun placed the folder on Min-jae's desk, sat down across from him, and said nothing, which was, in itself, a form of communication. Min-jae opened the folder. He read for 4 minutes without speaking. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a bird was making an unreasonable amount of noise for the time of morning. 3 schools, 7 funded programs across 5 countries. Anonymous donations to his own foundation, his foundation, from a holding company that, when traced with sufficient patience and Sung-hun's particular brand of forensic persistence, connected back to an investment portfolio that had been quietly, methodically built over 7 years by a woman whose name appeared nowhere in any of it. Min-jae turned a page. There was the Choi Syndicate intelligence. Not confirmed. Sung-hyun was too careful to state what he couldn't fully prove, but flagged, with the kind of careful language that meant Sung-hyun had proven it to his own satisfaction and was simply being diplomatic about how he delivered the information. Min-jae closed the folder. He sat for a long time. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "Portions of it," Sung-hyun said carefully, "for approximately 14 months. The complete picture 3 weeks ago. Why didn't you tell me?" Sung-hyun considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because, sir," he said at last, "some information changes everything. And I wanted to be certain I had all of it before I handed it to a man who tends to act before he finishes processing." Min-jae looked at him. Sung-hyun maintained eye contact with the calm of a man at complete peace with his life choices. "She built a school," Min-jae said, "in the village, the flooding village." "Yes, sir." She never said anything. "No, sir." Min-jae stood. He walked to the window. Seoul stretched out below him, the city he had shaped, controlled, and occasionally terrorized for the better part of a decade. He had always believed he understood power. He had written entire strategic philosophies around it. He had stared down governments with it. He had apparently been living inside the most elegant, most quietly devastating exercise of love he had ever witnessed, and had spent 7 years calling it indifference. The bird outside continued its unreasonable noise. "Find out everything about this awards ceremony," he said quietly. Sung-hyun, who had already researched it extensively the moment the invitation appeared in the household's peripheral mail monitoring, simply said, "Yes, sir." The evening of the ceremony arrived the way significant evenings always do, looking deceptively ordinary from the outside while carrying the full structural weight of everything that was about to change. Min-jae stood in front of his mirror at 6:47 p.m., adjusting a bow tie that did not need adjusting, wearing the expression of a man who had survived 17 assassination attempts and was currently more unsettled than he had been during any of them. His suit was black. His cufflinks were the plain silver ones, not the ornate pair his stylist always suggested, and he always rejected, because there was a version of wealth that announced itself, and a version that simply existed, and Min-jae had always preferred the latter. He had told his PR team he was attending for appearances. He had told Sung-hyun to have the car ready at 7. He had told himself, with the conviction of a man reciting something he no longer fully believed, that tonight was simply an obligation. A public appearance at a respectable event. Nothing more. He had not told anyone that he had read the audit folder 4 more times since Sung-hyun placed it on his desk, that he had sat in the village school's online profile for 40 minutes one evening, reading the names of the teachers Amma had hired, the curriculum she had helped design, the photograph of the building that stood on land where 3 years ago there had been nothing but flood damage and the memory of families with nowhere to go. That he had found, buried in the school's founding documents, a mission statement written in Amma's precise, elegant hand about building futures in places that had been told they didn't have one. He had read that mission statement 6 times. He was not, it is fair to say, attending tonight purely for appearances. Amma's preparation for the evening was characteristically different from her husband's. She did not stand in front of mirrors with unsettled expressions. She sat at her dressing table with the composed efficiency of a woman who had decided exactly who she was going to be tonight and required only the practical business of getting dressed to get there. Her gown was a deep burgundy, chosen 3 weeks ago with the quiet deliberateness she applied to everything, because burgundy was the color she had worn the first night she met Min Jae at the formal dinner where 2 families had sat across from each other and tried to look like they weren't conducting a transaction. She had worn burgundy then because her mother had told her to wear something that belonged entirely to herself. She was wearing it tonight for the same reason. Her jewelry was her grandmother's. Gold, heavy, Ghanaian. The kind of pieces that carried history in their weight and made a statement simply by existing. Her speech was not written down. She had thought about writing it, had sat at her desk twice with a blank page in front of her and a pen in her hand, and both times had understood that the words she needed to say tonight could not be rehearsed without becoming something smaller than they actually were. They needed to arrive the way they had lived inside her, unscripted, unguarded, exactly as true as they had always been. Her phone rang. Her mother, calling from Accra. "You're going tonight," her mother said. It was not a question. "Yes, Mama." A pause. Her mother had the particular silence of a woman who had raised a daughter alone in difficult circumstances and had consequently developed the ability to communicate entire paragraphs through strategic quiet. "And him? He'll be there." Another pause. "Amma." Her mother's voice shifted. Softer, the way it only went when she was saying something she had been holding for a long time. 7 years is a long time to love someone in a language they haven't learned yet. Amma looked at herself in the mirror. "I know, Mama." "Do you think he's ready to hear it?" She thought of the man down the hall who had eaten her soup in silence and said nothing, who had built a village's future anonymously and told no one, who had spent 7 years maintaining a careful distance from her while watching her across rooms with an expression he probably didn't know his face was making. "I think," Amma said carefully, "that it doesn't matter anymore whether he's ready. I think I'm ready, and that's enough." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "Wear the gold earrings, the big ones." Amma smiled. "Already on." They rode to the ceremony in the same car and did not speak about anything important. This was in itself remarkable progress. Min Jae asked whether she was comfortable. She said yes. She asked whether he had eaten before they left. He said he had. She nodded in a way that suggested she knew this was not entirely true. He looked out the window. She looked at her hands. The city moved past them in streaks of light, and the driver, who had worked for the Kang household for 5 years and had developed, through sheer accumulated exposure, the discretion of a professional secret keeper, kept his eyes on the road and his thoughts entirely to himself. At one point, caught at a long traffic light, Min Jae turned from the window and looked at her directly. In 7 years, he had looked at her countless times. But this was a different quality of looking, the kind that happens when someone has recently received information that rearranges the entire visual context of a person they thought they already understood. Amma felt it. She turned and met his eyes. Neither of them spoke. The light changed. The car moved. The moment passed the way important moments sometimes do, without resolution, carrying everything forward with it into whatever was coming next. The ballroom was exactly the kind of room that took itself very seriously. 300 guests from 40 countries arranged across tables that cost more to dress than most people's monthly rent. Crystal chandeliers. Interpreters in discreet earpieces. The particular low murmur of a room full of powerful people performing relaxed. Security at every entrance, though Min Jae's personal detail had already done a full sweep of the venue 2 hours before arrival, because some habits were simply non-negotiable, regardless of the occasion. They were seated at a prominent table near the front, which Min Jae had not arranged and which Amma had also not arranged, which meant the organizers had made the decision themselves, a fact that told Min Jae something about exactly how significant this evening was going to be. a fact he filed away behind his composed expression without allowing it to change his face. The ceremony proceeded. Awards were presented. Speeches were delivered with varying degrees of genuine emotion and rehearsed sincerity. Min-jae shook hands with three people he recognized from very different professional contexts and managed to do so without any of those contexts colliding visibly. He watched Amma. She was present at the table in the way she was always present, fully, warmly, without performance. She asked questions of the people seated near them that made those people feel immediately interesting. She laughed at two things that were genuinely funny and did not laugh at three things that were trying too hard to be. She ate her food with the relaxed appreciation of a woman who knew the difference between good cooking and expensive presentation and was pleased to find both in the same place tonight. She did not appear nervous. This, to Min-jae, was either remarkable composure or evidence that she didn't understand what was coming. He was about to discover it was the former. When the host announced the global humanitarian recognition, the evening's most prestigious honor, and began to describe in careful anonymized terms the extraordinary breadth of work carried out across 3 continents by a single individual who had operated entirely without public recognition for 7 years, Min-jae felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He knew the shape of that description. He had read it in a folder on his desk 3 weeks ago. When the name was called Amma Serwa Mensa, and the ballroom turned, and 300 people found her at the table near the front, and she rose with the stillness of someone who had already made peace with this moment, Min-jae did something he had not done in a very long time. He forgot how to arrange his face. She walked to that stage carrying 7 years of silence, wearing her grandmother's gold earrings and a burgundy dress the color of the night they first met, and she turned to face the room with the calm of a woman who had finally, completely, decided that the time for armor was over. Min-jae sat very still. The microphone was adjusted for her height. She smiled at the audience, that quiet, devastating smile, and then she found his face in the crowd, and for just a moment before she began, she looked at him the way she had never allowed herself to look at him across 7 years of careful distance. Like he was everything. Like he had always been everything. Like she was finally, after all this time, going to tell him so. Min-jae gripped the edge of the table, and Amma Serwa Mensa began to speak. She did not begin with thank you. This was the first thing the room noticed, that the woman standing at the microphone did not open with the standard gracious preamble that these ceremonies trained their honorees to deliver. No acknowledgement of the council. No humble deflection about not deserving the honor. No carefully structured opener designed to make 300 powerful people feel comfortable while the speaker found their footing. Amma Serwa Mensa stepped to that microphone and began with a confession. I have been in love with the same man for 7 years, she said, and I have never once told him. The ballroom, which had been producing the low, pleasant hum of an audience settling into the rhythm of a long evening, went completely silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for a speaker to make their point. The arrested silence of 300 people who had just felt the temperature in the room change and were now paying the kind of attention that cannot be performed. The kind that simply happens when a human being says something true in public without flinching. Min-jae stopped breathing. He did not notice that he had stopped. He would not notice for another several seconds, at which point his body would remind him forcefully, the way bodies do when the mind has been entirely overtaken by something it wasn't prepared for. Amma continued. She spoke about a man she had watched for 7 years. Not the man the world saw, not the empire, not the reputation, not the carefully constructed public surface that politicians respected and rivals feared. She spoke about the man she had actually watched, the one who came home at midnight and stood in the kitchen for 10 minutes, not eating anything, just standing, because he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The one who kept a photograph in his desk drawer, not displayed, never displayed, tucked beneath a stack of documents, of a village he had never publicly visited and had never allowed to be connected to his name. He funded the relocation of an entire community, Amma said, her voice carrying clearly across 300 people who were collectively holding their breath. Families who had lost everything to flooding. He arranged housing, infrastructure, the beginning of something livable. He did it without a press release, without a tax strategy, without any mechanism for personal benefit whatsoever. She paused. He made every person involved swear silence because he didn't want it weaponized in a negotiation. He wanted it to simply be a good thing done for no other reason than that it was the right thing to do. She looked at the audience. I found out from one of the families. A woman who didn't know who to thank, who described a man in an expensive coat who came, handled everything, and left without giving his name. Emma's voice remained steady, though the room could see what it cost her. I built a school there. I never told him, because that felt like the only language we both understood. Doing things for each other without saying so. Loving in silence because saying it out loud felt dangerous. At the table near the front, Kang Min-jae was experiencing something for which his considerable vocabulary had no word. It was not simply emotion, though emotion was certainly present, and was, if he was being factual about it, currently staging a full and hostile takeover of every defense mechanism he had spent the better part of a decade constructing. It was something more structural than that. It was the specific sensation of a man watching the entire architecture of a story he had told himself, carefully, consistently, for 7 years, being disassembled in real time by a woman with a microphone and the particular courage of someone who has finally decided that the truth matters more than the protection it cost her to keep. Every assumption he had built was collapsing. Quietly. Completely. The way well-designed structures fall, all at once, and then you're standing in the rubble, wondering how you missed the cracks. Sung-hyun, seated 2 tables back at Min-jae's quiet insistence on having security in the room, was looking at the tablecloth with the focused attention of a man who had decided that whatever was happening at the front table was private in a way that deserved to be respected even at a distance of 20 feet. Amma spoke about silence next. About how she had learned early in their marriage that the world his enemies occupied was one where personal attachment became ammunition. That to love him loudly was to hand his rivals a target with her face on it. That every soft thing she might have shown him openly was a vulnerability that could be traced, exploited, used against the man she was trying to protect. So I loved him the only way that felt safe, she said, from just far enough away that no one could use it against him. I thought the distance was protection. Her voice dipped slightly, recovered. I didn't understand until much too recently that from where he was standing, the distance just looked like absence. The room exhaled. Somewhere near the back, someone was crying. Several someones. The sound was very small and very human in a room that had spent the evening being large and impressive and important, and it landed in the silence with the weight of something real. Min-jae's jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the table. His eyes had not left her face from the moment she began speaking, and they were not leaving now, not because he was performing composure, but because he was genuinely, physically incapable of looking anywhere else. She had the room entirely, but she had him in a different way. The way you have someone when you are saying the thing they have needed to hear for 7 years without knowing they needed it. Amma reached into the evening then, past the ceremony and the chandeliers and the 300 witnesses, and she said the thing she had been carrying since the night she first met him. I loved him from the first day, not because of the power, not despite it, not as a transaction or an obligation or a performance of duty my family required of me. She paused. The pause of a woman choosing each word the way you choose something irreplaceable, with care and full awareness of what you're holding. I loved him because I saw him, really saw him, and he was worth every silent year it cost me to protect that. Then, I am telling him now, in front of everyone, because I have run out of reasons to keep it quiet, and because he deserves to know that he has never, not for a single day of these 7 years, been unloved. The ballroom rose, not gradually. All at once, the way a tide moves. 300 people on their feet before most of them had consciously decided to stand. Applause filling the room from floor to chandelier, with the particular thunder of people who have just witnessed something they know they will remember for the rest of their lives. Amma stood at the microphone in the storm of it, composed and undone in equal measure, tears on her face that she did not wipe away, because wiping them would have required pretending they weren't there, and she was, completely and finally, done pretending. And at the table near the front, Kang Min-jae, who had survived 17 assassination attempts, 2 government investigations, 1 catastrophic stock market manipulation, and 4 decades of believing that love was a liability he could not afford, sat completely still, while 7 years of misread silence, missed dinners, misunderstood gestures, and carefully constructed emotional distance crashed into him all at once. His chest hurt, not metaphorically, physically in the specific location where people point when they are trying to identify where feeling lives in the body. He pressed one hand flat against the table. The other he pressed quietly against his sternum. As though he could hold himself together through the simple application of pressure while everything he thought he understood rearranged itself into the true shape of the last 7 years. He thought about the soup. He thought about the curtains. He thought about the school in the village, standing on land he had cleared for a family that wasn't his, built by a woman who had never once asked to be thanked for it. He thought about 17 years of walls and one woman who had apparently decided that the walls were not her problem, that she would simply love him on both sides of them and wait for him to figure out the door. The applause continued, enormous and warm. Sung-hyun, 2 tables back, was looking at the ceiling now. His jaw was working slightly. He was, in the professional assessment of anyone who might have been watching, absolutely fine. He was not affected at all. He simply had something in his eye. Both of them. Min-jae stood. He was not aware in the moment of making the decision to stand. His body simply arrived at vertical, the way it had always moved toward things that mattered, without deliberation, without strategy, with the instinct of a man who had spent decades calculating every move and had finally run out of calculations. He looked at her across the ballroom. She found him in the crowd, found him the way she had always found him, without searching, the way you find something you have always known exactly where to keep. And for the first time in 7 years of marriage, Kang Min-jae let his face show everything. Not composed, not unreadable, not the controlled expression of a man who had turned emotional unavailability into a professional asset. Just real, wrecked, grateful in a way that had no sophisticated vocabulary, only the raw and unglamorous truth of a man who had just understood, too late and exactly in time, that he had been loved completely by someone extraordinary, and had spent 7 years calling it nothing. He pressed his hand to his chest again. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. The thing about a moment that changes everything is that life doesn't pause to let you process it properly. The applause continued. The ceremony continued. A host returned to the microphone with the slightly dazed energy of a man who had prepared remarks for a pleasant evening and was now professionally obligated to follow an emotional earthquake with a segue about the next award category. The room gradually, reluctantly, returned to its formal structure. The way water returns to level after something large has moved through it, still carrying the disturbance beneath a calm surface. Amma returned to the table. She sat down. She placed her award, a heavy crystal piece that caught the chandelier light and threw small rainbows across the tablecloth, beside her water glass. She smoothed her dress once. Then she folded her hands and looked straight ahead because she had just said the most honest thing she had ever said in her life in front of 300 people, and she needed exactly 30 seconds of looking at nothing before she was ready to look at him. She counted them. Then she turned. Min-jae was already looking at her. He had not, it appeared, stopped looking at her since she sat down. He was turned fully in his chair, not subtly, not with the studied peripheral awareness he normally applied to things he didn't want to appear affected by, but completely, directly, the way a man looks at something when he has stopped caring about what looking like that reveals about him. His eyes were still wet. He hadn't fixed that either. Amma looked at him. He looked at her. The ceremony murmured on around them, entirely irrelevant. "You built a school," he said. His voice was very quiet. In the ambient noise of the ballroom, it should have been difficult to hear. She heard every word. "You built a village," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Complex, layered, the specific expression of a man doing significant internal reconstruction in real time and not entirely sure of the structural integrity of what he's building. "I forgot about the village," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't." Another silence. The kind that had lived between them for 7 years but was tonight made entirely of different material. Not absence, not distance, something that had finally been correctly identified. The silence of 2 people who had been speaking the same language without realizing it. Standing on opposite sides of a translation they had both been too guarded to attempt. Amma. He said her name the way he rarely said it, not as identification, not as the beginning of a practical sentence, but as its own complete statement. The way you say a word when you have finally understood what it means. She waited. "I have spent 7 years," he said slowly, as though he was building the sentence carefully because it needed to hold weight. "Believing that you were here because you had to be, that the marriage was an obligation you honored because that was the kind of woman you were, that everything you did." He stopped, pressed his lips together briefly, continued. "I told myself the silence meant nothing, that the kindness was character, not directed, not at me specifically. I know, she said again, gently. I was wrong. He said it without cushioning, without the lawyerly qualifications he typically applied to any admission that cost him something. Just, directly, plainly, the way you say a thing when the time for managing how it lands has passed. I was completely wrong, and I am. Another stop. The word seemed to require more room than the sentence had originally allocated for it. I am sorry. For every dinner I chose the empire over, for every time I interpreted your strength as indifference, for every moment I decided the distance between us was your doing when it was mine. Amma's eyes filled. She had not expected the apology. She had hoped for understanding, had stood at that microphone hoping for nothing more than that he would finally see clearly what had always been there. The apology was something additional, something that arrived and rearranged things in its own quiet way. You weren't the only one who was afraid, she said. I could have told you. 100 times, I could have simply said it. She glanced down briefly, then back up. I convinced myself the silence was strategy, that protecting you meant protecting the feeling too. But the truth is, she exhaled. The truth is, I was afraid that if I said it and you didn't, that if the words went out and came back empty, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He understood, more than understood, recognized. The specific fear of a person who has been hurt in the place where they kept their most important things and has consequently decided that the safest approach is to keep those things hidden, even from the people they most want to share them with. He had written the manual on that particular fear. He reached across the table. It was not a dramatic gesture. He didn't stand, didn't cross the ballroom, didn't do anything that the 300 people around them would have found cinematically satisfying. He simply reached across the white tablecloth, past the crystal glasses and the untouched dessert course, and placed his hand over hers. She looked down at his hand, then up at him. I see you, he said quietly. I should have said it years ago, but I am saying it now, and I will keep saying it. I see you, Amma. Everything you did, everything you built, everything you carried without asking me to notice. His hand tightened over hers slightly. I notice. I will not stop noticing. The tear that had been sitting at the edge of her eye for the last several minutes made its decision and arrived on her cheek. She laughed, a small, surprised sound, and reached up to catch it. 7 years, she said softly. 7 years, he agreed. We were both very stubborn. You were more stubborn. Statistically, yes. She laughed again, properly this time, and the laugh was the most beautiful thing in the room, which was saying something given the chandeliers. They left before the ceremony ended. Min-jae informed his PR team via a brief text that he was leaving early for personal reasons and that they were welcome to manage the optics, however they saw fit. His PR team, who had spent 7 years managing the optics of a man who gave them approximately zero creative input, found this to be a refreshing change of pace and immediately began composing a narrative about the devoted couple slipping away quietly because some moments are too private for public consumption, which was both accurate and excellent content. The car was waiting, the same driver, the same city moving past the windows in streaks of light, except everything was different. Amma sat with her award in her lap and her head tilted back against the seat, looking at the city with the relaxed openness of a woman who had set something down that she had been carrying for a very long time. Min-jae sat beside her, close, in a way he hadn't been in the car on the way there, the careful, measurable distance between them replaced by something warmer and considerably less strategic. His hand found hers again in the dark of the back seat. She turned her palm up and held on. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The city passed. The driver remained exemplarily focused on the road. The school in Kumasi, Min-jae said eventually. The principal, she sent a photograph of the children on the first day. Amma turned her head to look at him. How do you know about the photograph? The audit. She stared at him. You audited me? I audited anonymous philanthropy connected to our household. That is, Amma said, with the measured precision of a woman selecting her words, an incredibly Min-jae way to discover that your wife loves you. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. On his particular face, with his particular history, slightly embarrassed looked remarkably good. The girl, he said. In the photograph, she was touching the chalkboard. Amma's expression softened completely, like it was something sacred. Yes, he looked at her. You did that. We did that, she said quietly. Your village, my school, same children. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this, The way the two halves of something fitted together when you finally stopped trying to understand them separately and looked at the complete shape instead. I want to go, he said. To the school. To the village. Together. I want to see what we built. Amma squeezed his hand. I've been waiting for you to say that. You could have taken me at any time. You didn't have to wait for me to figure it out. Yes, I did, she said simply. Because you needed to want to go. Not because I asked you. Because you understood why it mattered. She studied his face in the passing city light. Do you understand now? He thought about 7 years. About soup on a desk and blue curtains and a journalist who never filed his story, and a school standing on land he had tried to make livable, and a woman who had quietly, without recognition or request, loved him into a better version of everything he was already trying to be. I'm starting to, he said. She nodded. That was enough. With Min Jae, starting was always the significant thing. Starting meant the walls were coming down. Starting meant he had chosen, consciously and without pressure, to walk through the door she had been leaving open since the first night she arrived in a cream dress from Accra and decided the world would have to earn her tears. He had earned them. It had only taken 7 years, 1 awards ceremony, and the specific courage of a woman who had decided that loving in silence was no longer a language she was willing to speak alone. 3 months later, Kang Min-jae and Ama Serwa Mensa stood together in a schoolyard in a village that had been rebuilt from floodwater and anonymous generosity, watching children run between classrooms with the magnificent carelessness of people who have no idea they are living inside someone else's love story. A small girl,